Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's quite extraordinary, it seems to me, to have, 40 people coming out on a cold and a bit wet night to hear about Deuteronomy, of all things. I mean, really. It is a book I have loved since I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, I was reading bits of the Bible, here and there, and sort of scattered version. And I thought, I really need to read the Bible from beginning to end. And I think they're just going to try and get the microphone setting right. Thanks, Ray and Merv. And so I started reading Genesis, and that's quite interesting. And the first half of Exodus is quite interesting as well. But once you hit the middle of Exodus, it sort of gets a bit tougher. Laws upon laws of building this tabernacle thing. And then you go through it all again when they actually build it. And so my reading of the Bible was sort of grinding. And I had to do a train trip, as I did periodically, it was either from Sydney to Melbourne or vice versa, I've forgotten. I was a teenager, I was probably 18, maybe 19. And I thought, well, I'm going to use a boring train trip to get through the boring parts of the Old Testament. And that is finish Exodus, read Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That was my aim. And I read through those books on the train trip. And when I hit Deuteronomy, something triggered in my heart. And I started writing notes. I had those notes until only about 10 or 12 years ago. When I lived overseas, all my stuff in storage here, about 12 years ago, got water damage. And I lost lots and lots of stuff. And they included, I discovered later, the notes that I'd written. There was nothing profound in them, let me tell you. I was only a teenager. But they were sort of a little memento for me of my first ever reading of Deuteronomy. And I fell in love with Deuteronomy then, when I was 18 or 19. So that when a few years later, before I was studying theology full-time, Deuteronomy was something that I'd come back to. I remember preaching on it before I went full-time to Ridley College, but when I was a lay preacher and church warden at St Jude's Carlton. That would have been 1984 or 85. And then at Ridley, I majored in Old Testament. My major essay was on Deuteronomy. And I remember one of the lecturers at Ridley saying, an idea for all people in ministry is to keep reading all through the scriptures, but to have one book in each testament that you keep coming back to go deeper and deeper. I instantly thought that's Deuteronomy. And then I graduated from Ridley. I finished studying in 1989. And the very next year I was asked back to teach Deuteronomy as a subject. And then 2 years later I was full-time on faculty at Ridley under pressure to do a PhD, which I never wanted to do. And I thought, well, if this is of God, we'll see what doors open or close. The door instantly opened to do a PhD under a scholarship in the UK. And I did my PhD on Deuteronomy. And you think that might get it out of your system. But no. I think I've preached or taught or given seminars like tonight on Deuteronomy, I suspect every year without fail, since I was ordained in 1990. And I still love this book. I've taught it as a unit in Bible colleges in many parts of the world. I've used it as sort of talks for clergy conferences or other conferences, church camps, things like that. Preached it in Sunday services, as I'll be doing one of your weeks here in a few weeks' time. And I still find a deep love of this book of Deuteronomy. My hope is that tonight, when you go from here, maybe you've fallen in love with Deuteronomy as well. It is a stunning book. And on the handout that you've got, I hope you've all got a handout in front of you, I found years and years ago that William Tyndale wrote these glowing words about Deuteronomy. Now, William Tyndale, in case you don't know, was famous for translating the Bible. And it's actually 500 years ago this year that his New Testament was published in English. I think that's probably one of the most significant things in church history, at least in English sort of church history, ever, actually. Because the idea of translating into your own language then, I mean, we've got dozens of English Bibles around, was so new. And because it was coming out of Latin, which nobody understood. So it was a trigger in the Reformation, but it was also a trigger for mission. And ever since then, I think, especially in the last 250 years, the idea of translating the Bible into your own language so that people can read and understand the gospel and come to faith. And I think Tyndale was a significant catalyst for that. So that's a little digression. But what he wrote on Deuteronomy is, it is a book worthy to be read in day and night. Now, a couple of you are saying you read a chapter today. Well, Tyndale says read a chapter tonight as well. Read in day and night, and never to be out of hands. For it is the most excellent of all the books of Moses, that is Genesis through to Deuteronomy. It is easy also. I'm not quite sure that I've always agreed with that, but there we are. It is easy also and light, and a very pure gospel. That is, to wit, a preaching of faith and love, deducing the love to God out of faith, and the love of a man's neighbour out of the love of God. I think that's a wonderful summary. And behind that, as I'll come to at different points in this session tonight, is an understanding not just of Deuteronomy, but in fact it reflects so much of how we ought to read the Old Testament. We often read it as a contrast to the New, and that it's sort of like plan A that failed and plan B is the New Testament that succeeds, all of which I think is fundamentally wrong. And so Tyndale gets it right, and I hope that if you've got questions about that, by the end of tonight you've thought them through. Deuteronomy gives us a pretty neat introduction, actually. Often in a book, you want to know lots of basic questions, and the first paragraph of Deuteronomy does that. So in chapter 1, verse 1 to 5 is like an introductory paragraph. It's written in the third person, that is, it refers to Moses as Moses, whereas most of the book that follows, Moses is speaking, so it's I to you. And this opening paragraph tells us who is the book from? And the answer is Moses. To whom is the book? And we could say it's Israel. But notice in verse 1, these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel. And this comes up a few times in the book. And it's elaborated on perhaps in chapter 29 a little bit more as well. The people to whom Moses spoke were not the elders. They were not the men only who were elders. He spoke to every Israelite. Now, we don't quite know how physically that might have happened, but it's children and adults, it's men and women, it's slaves and free, it's experienced and inexperienced, everyone. All Israel. It's not just to one tribe. Tribes are mentioned to different parts in the book, but Deuteronomy perhaps emphasizes the unity of the people of God. You might be a Levite, or you might come from Issachar or Judah or Benjamin or whatever, but there is quite an emphasis in Deuteronomy of belonging together as one nation fundamentally. That's where your key identity is in God, rather than say, well, I belong to this tribe and we happen to belong together. It's still echoing a bit, Merv, somehow. That's nothing there, I don't know. So all Israel is whom is being addressed, who's being addressed. And it just reflects a little bit that when we read the Bible, it's worth paying attention to all the little words, because it's easy to skip over that. Just, oh yes, he speaks to Israel, but it's all Israel. Where does this book originate? Well, let me, there's different ways of answering this. In verse 2, it says, In my translation, east of the Jordan, that is the Arabah, opposite these places, and so on. But, and then again in verse 5. But actually the NIV, which is what I've got here, sort of cheats a little bit for us. If this is the Jordan River, and this is the Dead Sea, and this is the Sea of Galilee at the top, the language that's used actually is beyond the Jordan. Now, if you've got an NRSV or an RSV or ESV, it's probably got the word beyond in verse 5. NIV has got east. And east is correct, but there's actually something a little bit vaguer about beyond, but it's actually more important in a way. If I'm here, beyond the Jordan is over here. If I'm here, beyond the Jordan is over here. That's obvious enough. So where is this introductory paragraph from? It's saying Moses spoke, in verse 5, beyond the Jordan. We know that Moses speaks here, actually, just on the northeast end of the Dead Sea, in what is modern-day Jordan. And so the introductory paragraph has been put there after Moses' death from someone inside the Promised Land. And the beyond is not just saying, oh, it's the other side, but it's actually outside the Promised Land. Now that's a sort of thrust, of course, that really runs through Exodus through to Deuteronomy. Israel is not in the Promised Land. And Moses dies outside the Promised Land. That's specifically referred to a few times in the book, in chapters 1 and 3 and 4, and later on as well, and then he dies in the last chapter, 34. So where does this book come from? Well, the opening paragraph, an editor, I take it, is over here somewhere, but the book comes from this side of the Jordan, outside the Promised Land. In the land of Moab, as it was called then, and I'll elaborate a bit more on that map in a few minutes. When? Now, we can answer the when question in all sorts of ways. What year, what month, what season? What does it say here? In verse 3, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month. Well, the 1st of November is the first day of the 11th month. The 40th year. What is that? Well, it's firstly a general comment. We're used to saying this is 2026, but you can't do that in the ancient world before, well before Christ, and even the years after Christ initially, because you don't have a fixed year number. We might say such and such happened in 7 BC or 707 BC, but we can only say that from being after Christ. So all dates in the Old Testament and in the ancient world pre-Christ are what we call relative dates. It's the 40th year of something or since something. And if you read the Old Testament, in the 7th year of so-and-so's reign, something happened, or in the 2nd year after an earthquake, something happened. They're all relative dates. And so the 40th year of what? It takes us actually back to Exodus chapter 12. And that's when the first Passover occurs. They're in Egypt under Pharaoh, and the first Passover happens in the 2nd week, I guess, of the first month of the, as it's later called, the first year. And so what it's telling us is we're now in the 40th year. But then it goes on to say, it takes, in verse 2, before verse 3, it takes 11 days to get from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. Now, why is that there? NIV puts it in brackets, which means don't bother reading it, it's boring. But actually, it's there for a reason. So what's it saying? The 40th year is saying it's taken 40 years to get from Egypt to the plains of Moab, where the asterisk is. That's a long time. Now, it took me almost 40 years to get here tonight. The traffic was pretty bad on the Eastern Freeway. And, I felt my 40 years. And, but it's only 11 days to get from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. So just to fill in this map a little bit more, as you can see, that's the map of Israel. And what are you laughing at? Egypt is down here. This here is the Med, the dead. This is the red. Galilee doesn't rhyme. And Mount Sinai is down here. There are different views on where Mount Sinai is. Some people put it in Saudi Arabia and all that sort of thing, but almost the mainstream, and I think rightly so, it puts it sort of at that end, and that's the traditional place. If you've ever been to St. Catherine's Monastery or climbed Mount Sinai, as I've done a couple of times, that's the place, and I think that's the right place. So from there to Kadesh Barnea, which is about here, it's only 11 days' journey, and it took 6 weeks to get to Sinai. But we're in the 40th year. Implicitly, it'll be explicit later in the chapter, implicitly, the introduction is saying Israel took a long time to get where they should have been a long time earlier. That is, it begins with an echo of their failure to enter the promised land thus far. That's an interesting thing, in my opinion. It's not as a sermon at the end of a life, you'd expect, come on, you can do it. You know, you remember maybe Obama's great speech in 2008 before the US election, and his refrain, yes we can, but that's not biblical. It was persuasive then, but it's not biblical. And Israel's failure is this recurring theme through Deuteronomy, and of course we know the detail from Numbers in particular, the book before. So when was this? Well, it's the 40th year. It's a long time from when they left Egypt. And behind that lies all the failure of the spies story, and I'll come to that a little bit more a bit later on, because Moses reiterates that in chapters 1 to 3. So that's the where and the when. The other part of the when, maybe I'll just... yes, I didn't put it on these notes, but scholars have different views on dates because it's ancient and so on. There are the skeptical scholars who say it never happened. There are those who say it happened but later, and their date would be about 1250 BC, 1200 BC, that 1250. I think the biblical dates take us to about 1450 to 1400 BC. But you know, it's not a big issue, but that's the sort of period we're talking about, broadly speaking. And I may come back to date issues a bit later. So where, that side of the Jordan, when, 40th year, that's the crucial thing. What is Deuteronomy? Well, it's a book, but it is a speech, really. A sermon, actually. Moses is preaching. These are the words Moses spoke, is how chapter 1, verse 1 begins. And you get that echoed again in verse 3. Moses proclaimed, and in verse 5, Moses began to expound this law. Not every book in the Bible originates as an oral communication. Lots of books in the Bible begin as written communication. The letters, Paul, Peter, John, and so on, they begin as written. Maybe Paul recited it for somebody, Tychicus, or someone to write down, but it's basically a written communication. The Gospels, the history books, they're all written communications. Luke wrote down his Gospel, and others wrote. But Deuteronomy, and perhaps the prophets, and maybe bits and pieces elsewhere, begin as oral documents. And then they're written down. And Deuteronomy 31, near the end of the book, speaks about Moses then wrote down all the words of this law. Now, I take it that he wrote down his sermon, which is chapter 1, verse 6, really through the end of chapter 30. I'll go through the contents, as you can see on the handout, in a minute. And there's a couple of appendices, in a sense, at the back. That is Moses writing it, Moses' song, Moses' blessing, and the death of Moses. And whether Moses added them in himself, or whether the editor who was on this side of the Jordan put them all together, doesn't matter too much. But the purpose of my point here is that it's a sermon, actually. It's not really just a speech. Moses preaches before he dies, his final sermon. It's a long sermon. So if ever you think Isaac preaches too long, or the bishop preaches too long, then just remember Moses' sermon is longer, I'm sure. But it's a sermon that is then written. And I think one of the reasons why it touched my heart all those years ago is because I could feel the preaching to me. Not that, the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, they're written ultimately for us as well. But there was something about the style of Deuteronomy that pierced my heart, I think. And I hope that happens for you as well. And I think there are little snippets of oral communication and rhetoric, I'll touch on that theme a bit later, through the book. But why the book? And that's a critical question. And perhaps verse 5 helps us pick up both the what and the why. East of the Jordan, or beyond the Jordan, in the territory of Moab, Moses began to expound this law. And I think one of the differences between it being a written document of law and Deuteronomy being an oral sermon preaching the law is that, in a sense, Leviticus, let's say, for law, but Exodus as well and a bit of Numbers, is a bit more, this is what the law is, and yes, you should do it. Whereas Deuteronomy is, well, you know what the law is, now do it. A bit more emphasis, if you like, on the exposition, the expounding, the urgency of it. And we'll come to, as I say, to some of the rhetoric that helps us see the sermon style a little bit later as well. So that's my brief introduction that comes out of the first paragraph. And if I spent the same amount of time on every paragraph, we'll be here well beyond 9 p.m. tonight, but I'm not going to do that. I want to say a little bit about the importance of Deuteronomy. Andrew's introduction commented that we maybe don't have a lot of love for Deuteronomy and so on. But I think this is actually quite an important book. In a sense, Deuteronomy brings together what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. All the major themes of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are recapitulated in Deuteronomy. If anything, the one theme that is not strong in Deuteronomy is that God is the creator of all things, Genesis 1 and 2. But there's a strong doctrine of sin, promises to Abraham, the Exodus theme, the land theme, the descendants theme, and law. All those big things in those first 4 books are brought together, tied together in Deuteronomy. So in one sense, if you get Deuteronomy, you sort of get the Pentateuch. Secondly, what follows Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, is often called by scholars, don't worry about this word, but the Deuteronomistic history. What they mean by that is history written from the point of view of Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy doesn't disagree with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but it does have its own distinctive way of speaking and language. So that when you read Joshua through to 2 Kings, to the story of the exile, you realise that whoever has written those books, maybe multiple people over different times, they are very aware of the book of Deuteronomy. Solomon loved the Lord, David loved the Lord, his God, with all his heart and soul. That expression, heart and soul, is in Deuteronomy. It's not in Genesis to Numbers. In the book of Joshua, they make a treaty with the Gibeonites. That has been warned against in Deuteronomy. Do not make a treaty with them. The place of worship, temple later in Jerusalem, but no Canaanite worship places. That is a Deuteronomy emphasis. It's sort of assumed in Exodus, Leviticus, but it's emphasised in Deuteronomy, and that emphasis is picked up in the good kings, few of them there were, especially in Josiah. It's certainly clear that King Josiah, when he seeks to reform the country in 626 onwards BC, the book of Deuteronomy is part of the instigation of that reform. We might come to that later if we get time. So there's something about Deuteronomy that is foundational for reading Joshua through to Kings. Deuteronomy has a law about a king. There are no kings, of course, until you get to Samuel, after Samuel, with Saul and then later David. But the whole theme about a king, which comes back in those later books, 2 Samuel and Kings, Deuteronomy sort of provides a foundation. And there are other words and phrases and themes as well. So Deuteronomy, in a way, is a bit foundational for those history books. We could also say the same a little bit for the prophets. Even though the language perhaps doesn't resonate quite so much, Jeremiah and Hosea probably have a bit more language resonance with Deuteronomy. But there is something foundational in Deuteronomy that the prophets, I think, build on. Especially when they are bringing words of curse or woe or judgment. And what they recognise is that what God is doing, has done, or will do by bringing disease or enemy attacks or even exile, loss of land, these sorts of things, they're all there in Deuteronomy as a warning in chapter 28. Amos, for example, in Amos 4 speaks about, I brought you in effect a famine. He says cleanness of teeth, but he doesn't mean Colgate. He means no food and a famine and no rain, yet you did not turn to me. That's in Deuteronomy 28. That is, God says, if you disobey me, there'll be a famine and no rain. The enemy attacks and things like that, they're all warned about in Deuteronomy. What then the prophets are doing with their warnings, and I think it's not, I think it generally across the board for the prophets, is they know what are called the curses at the end of the law in Deuteronomy in chapter 28. They know them. They see their context, their contemporary place in the eyes of God's word. They realise that the famine we've got, or the disease, or the enemy attack, or our loss of land, all these different things that are happening that are bad, they interpret them in the light of Deuteronomy 28, and thus they issue warnings to the people that God is judging them and will judge them. So Deuteronomy is sort of foundational, especially for the warnings. The prophets also have a promise of a return from exile. Some of them do, not all. But that's also in Deuteronomy, in chapter 30, for example. So the idea of even hope, part of that is expressed in Deuteronomy. And then I suppose there's maybe less obvious connection with the wisdom books, although there is one Jewish scholar in early 70s wrote a PhD on the wisdom influence in Deuteronomy. And there is some. It talks about being wise in Deuteronomy 4. But especially history-wise. But when you get to the New Testament, Deuteronomy, I think, is the third most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. So do you know the first three? Psalms, Isaiah, and I think Genesis is number three, and then Deuteronomy. Where in the New Testament is Deuteronomy quoted? Well, yes, but which words of Jesus? Love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God, great commandment. You're going to say that? Matthew? Any other things you can think of?
You've heard it said.
Yes, you've heard it said.
What's that? The Sermon on the Mount.
Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. Do not commit adultery, but I say to you, do not murder. 10 Commandments. That's in Deuteronomy. It's in Exodus too, but it's also in Exodus 20, but it's in Deuteronomy 5. Yep. In the wilderness temptations of Jesus, he quotes from the Old Testament. Which one of them is from Deuteronomy? Oh, this is testing you on a Wednesday night, isn't it? All of them. All of them. All three times, Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy 6 or 8. You shall not worship anyone else. Man lives on bread alone, and do not put the Lord your God to the test. They're all in Deuteronomy 6 or 8. Why is that? That's a harder question. The answer, I think, is because Israel in the Old Testament is sort of like the child of God, the Son of God. That language is used in Exodus 4. Jesus is showing that in his wilderness experience, which is 40 days, not 40 years, where Israel failed time and time and time again, which is what Deuteronomy 6 and 8 is reflecting, Jesus was the true Son of God, not yielding to temptation. There's lots of other places where Deuteronomy is alluded to or quoted. In Romans chapter 10, that Christ is the goal of the law, and you do not have to go up to heaven or cross the sea to get the gospel. That's from Deuteronomy 30. There's echoes of the quotes of in a couple of places of the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, as we've said, the Great Commandment, the Ten Commandments, a whole range of different things, and specific other laws about adultery, marriage of brothers, and when someone dies, all these sorts of things, lots of them. Deuteronomy's there much more than we quite realise, I think. So if you get Deuteronomy, I think you're going to get a lot about the sort of how the Bible sort of holds together. So I hope that encourages you. The contents, I've given you a list of contents here, and you don't obviously have to remember, and I've just tried deliberately to give you just one or two words for each chapter. But let me explain that to you, and why I've done it like this. We're going to come back to chapters 1 to 3 a little bit later, maybe after the break. We'll see how we go for time. But the first 4 chapters are a little bit more of the background history. There's the introduction we've looked at, but then chapters 1, 2 and 3 remind Israel about the spies incident, where they failed to conquer the land when the spies went in, and that's back in Numbers 13 and 14. So it's not the first time we're reading it, and Moses, I think, is preaching from that event, but from Numbers 13 and 14, and applying it to this generation. I'll come to that point soon. And chapter 4 builds on that, reminding them of God speaking to them at Sinai and rescuing them from Egypt. In a way, there's sort of historical reminiscence, we could say. But then comes the law. And it begins with the Ten Commandments, just as Exodus's law at Sinai begins with the Ten Commandments. One of the emphases in Deuteronomy is that the law in Deuteronomy is no different from the law in Exodus and Leviticus. What God gave then as the law, here it is again, Moses to Israel. So the Ten Commandments is at the head of the law in both books. And I think there is something about the significance of that. Some suggest that it doesn't quite work perfectly. But let me just sort of give you something to stimulate some of your minds anyway. It's not everyone's cup of tea is what I mean. If you've got the Ten Commandments like this, no other gods, no graven images and so on, there's a sense in which Deuteronomy 6 to 26 follows sort of the Ten Commandments in a bigger, broader, and let me say slightly creative way. So honour your parents in number 5. In that section of Deuteronomy, there's nothing about parents, but there are authority figures in chapters 16 to 18 of the judges, priests, prophets and kings, people in authority. It's not a perfect match, but over the last, I think the first, when was it, 1979 was the first article I read on this, or from that date, not I didn't read it in that year. And people have built on this and played around with it in different articles over the years. The point I suppose I want to make tonight is not so much the technical academic one. The point is that there's something about the Ten Commandments that is like a summary of the principles of the law of God to his people. And they're fleshed out in a range of detail. In particular, the first two, no other gods and no graven images. In chapters 6 to 11, you've got lots of very general principles about relating to God, putting God first. No other idols, no Canaanite worship places, no wrong sacrifices, one place of worship, these sorts of ideas. And whilst the pattern doesn't fully match, there's some laws in here about murder that don't quite fit in the right place, so to speak. Moses is preaching, and I suspect that through the law, he's got in the back of his mind the 10 Commandments, and he's reiterating law out of Exodus and Leviticus in broadly that sort of order. So the 10 Commandments is a bit like a sort of summary over the law. You've got to be a bit creative in sort of how does it get applied. But what it helps us see, I think, is that law is not just principles up here, but actually it must be anchored in life on earth in different ways. I may come back to that point if we've got time later. So the 10 Commandments, chapter 6, Shema, that's the Hebrew word for hear, as in listen, O Israel. And I put it there because hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength, which sometimes we use in Anglican liturgy, is often called the Shema, the hear, O Israel, the great commandment. That's where it comes in chapter 6. Chapter 7 is more about conquering the nations but not falling for their worship, being holy. Chapter 8 is where you get, you shall not live by bread alone, the lesson from the wilderness. And now you'll be going into a place of plenty. Make sure the lessons from the wilderness, you keep those lessons in the place of plenty. The golden calf, back in Exodus 32 to 34, reiterated in chapter 9, and Moses' prayer of intercession that stops God destroying Israel. And in chapter 10, following on from that, the replacement of the tablets of stone that were destroyed by Moses under God, and a general call to obey. I think it's that chapter I'm preaching on when I come here. Is that chapter 10? Yeah. I won't say more about it now. Chapter 11 sort of brings many of those themes together. But from chapter 12, hence the line on the outline, now become a bit more detailed laws. Chapter 12 is distinctive. As I said, the history books that follow Joshua to Kings pick up particular emphases and wording in Deuteronomy. And one very key law is the law of central worship. You shall have one place among all your tribes where you shall have sacrificial worship. Only one. It's not named in Deuteronomy. We think, oh, it's Jerusalem. But actually it seems to be before Jerusalem, if you read the history books, at least it seems to be Shiloh, and then the ark is captured and it goes to Beth Shemesh and eventually comes to Jerusalem in David's time. And there it stays and the temple is built. So there seems to be one place of sacrificial worship. I think they would have worshipped by way of song and hearing the word expounded and maybe prayer in all their villages led by Levite priests. But the sacrifices must only be in one place and not a Canaanite place. So that law is, we're beginning to get a bit more detailed. False prophets, people even in your family who lead you astray, chapter 13's theme. Chapter 14, what foods can you eat and not eat? This is where you can't eat pork or prawn, for example, and so on. In chapter 15, laws about generosity. So make sure you care for the poor. Open your hand to them. Be generous to the poor. Notice how there are principles of generosity, but it gets anchored in specific action of cancelling debts and letting slaves go free in chapter 15. Chapter 16 deals with the key festivals. The three key ones would be Passover. We know that well. That's sort of anchored in Jesus' death for us around the time of March, April. 7 weeks later, the feast of Harvest Feast, Feast of Weeks. We call it Pentecost from a Greek term, but Pentecost is 50 days, which of course is 7 weeks inclusive of the days at the end. And the Feast of Weeks is its Old Testament name. And then later in the year, September, October in our calendar, the Feast of Tabernacles. All of them have remembrance type ideas behind them of the time in the wilderness, of coming out of Egypt, of living in the wilderness in tabernacles and so on. Then come at the very end of chapter 16 and all of 17 into 18, laws about leaders. The judges at the end of 16, the king, the priests and the prophets. Interestingly in these, there is, whilst we might think of the king as being the supreme ruler, for example, that's how people in the United States think about kings, obviously, from their protest about not having kings. But in Deuteronomy, it's clear that there is not meant to be one supreme ruler over the people of God. There is a balance of power. The judges are appointed by the people in their own villages and towns. The priests come chosen by God because he chose the tribe of Levi, and that's where the priestly line is from. The king is chosen by God, accepted by the people, and the judges, and the prophets are chosen by God because he puts his word into their mouth and they speak. So the king doesn't rule over the other three. And all of them have to be, in a sense, under God's word. The king has to write it down for himself. Remember, they don't have multiple books like we do. The judges and the priests have to operate under the word of God, and the prophet has to speak the word of God. And we see stories like Balaam and Micaiah later in the prophets, and different prophets who are false or true prophets speaking the word of God. The point is that God is the authority and the real king. And all these humans have a balance of power. I think even though, in a church life we don't have kings and prophets and judges and priests exactly the same as that, the sense of balance of power, I think, is an important principle for God's people even today. Cities of refuge in chapter 19. If you accidentally kill someone, then you flee to a city of refuge so that vengeance can't be taken against you, what those cities are in the land. Warfare laws, fighting war. And perhaps briefly to say at this point, because this is a controversial issue, especially in the last 25 years, more and more has been written on this topic in 25 years, I think, than the 100 years before it, interestingly. I think that's since 9/11. The warfare is actually limited. They can only really take aggressive action inside the promised land. Outside the promised land, they may expand, but they offer peace treaty first. And if that's declined, then you might end up in war. And so it is helpful, I think, because of the significance of this ethical issue, that we recognise that the law says what should happen. The narrative, that is, let's say, Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, Kings, and other narrative books, tell us what did happen, which is not always what should have happened. So you've got to judge it against the law. Then there's laws about murder, marriage, children, sexual conduct in 22. Some people who can't be part of the assembly if they've come from other countries for a few generations. A range of miscellaneous laws is the best way I can describe it in 24 and 5. Beginning of 22, for example, there's laws about birds' nests, clothing, and parapets on the roof, and helping up a broken animal. So there's lots of specific detail of laws in these chapters. And then finally in 26, when you enter the land, there'll be a celebration of the first fruits of your harvest because you've arrived in the land. And then wrapping up the speech. What happens if you don't keep the law? What happens if you do? In chapter 27, there's a ceremony on Mount Ebal and Gerizim. These are two little, more than a hill, but a steepish hill, a bit like the Yuyangs, if I can put it like that. They sort of rise out of nothing. And Ebal in the north, Gerizim in the south. Shechem is the town on the shoulder, literally is what Shechem means, in between. Nablus is the city today. And this ceremony will have curses and blessings. And what I think the ceremony is doing in chapter 27 is it says, on Mount Ebal, the Mount of Curse, you shall build a pillar covered in plaster, and on it write all the words of this law, all of Deuteronomy. Now that's an unusual thing because plaster would eventually be washed away in the rain. But it's a one-off ceremony on arrival in the land. Why this place? Shechem is where the promise of land was first made to Abraham in Genesis 12. That's my reading of why it's the place. And why is the law there? I think it's on the Mount of Curse, Ebal, because under the law we fail. But next to it is to be an altar, made of uncut stone. It can't be Canaanite. And on that altar you sacrifice a burnt offering to deal with sin, and a fellowship or peace offering to express your fellowship with God, now that your sin has been taken away. Those three things, I think, are significant theologically. That is, the law shows us we fail. The burnt offering shows us God offers us a way of dealing with our failure sin, and now we have peace with God. And when you think about it, Anglican liturgy is a bit like that. We hear the Great Commandments, or in the old Book of Common Prayer, the 10 Commandments sometimes. Then we lead into confession because we realise that under the law we fail. And then we recognise and remember Jesus' death for us, and we celebrate the Lord's Supper at peace and fellowship with God. So theologically, I think it's significant. What I think the curses are also doing is saying, yes, in your society, you might find a murderer or a thief or somebody who doesn't do the right thing and you punish them. But what happens if nobody is ever found out, or somebody is never found out? And what it's saying, I think, is that they are still under a curse because God knows. God is the ultimate judge. So cursed is the person who sets up an idol in secret. Well, maybe nobody ever knows that. But God does. And that person's cursed. They're under God's judgment, that is. And that's a reminder to us, I think. Our human judgment system may fail. We may think we get away with stuff, but under God we don't. What is the curse? That's chapter 28. 28 begins with blessings, just 14 verses, but then 54 verses of curse. And I think what it's saying is, expect the curse because you'll fail. But if you obey, you'll be blessed. You'll have crops and animals and rain and safety, and your territory will be safe. You'll be blessed. But if you disobey this law, chapter 28, verse 15 onwards, then you'll be cursed. You'll have illness, blindness, a famine, drought. Enemies will attack you, and ultimately you'll go into exile and lose the land entirely. That's what the curse is. Chapter 29 reiterates the idea that, yes, you've made a covenant with God today, but maybe somebody's going to lead you astray. Maybe their heart will lead them and therefore others astray, away from God. And you'll end up in exile. That's the expectation, I think, at the end of Deuteronomy, is a negative one. The curses outweigh the blessings. The curses are if you disobey, and then later when you disobey. Chapter 29 takes you into exile. But chapter 30, which I think is a glorious chapter, is of the promise of a return. And God will change your heart so that you will love him and obey him and be restored to the land, more prosperous and blessed than even your ancestors were. And that promise, I think, gets picked up a few times later in the Old Testament as well. The end of the book is Moses writing it down so that future generations, even us, have it, passing the leadership to Joshua in chapter 31. And in 32, he writes a song. It wasn't in the Classic 100, I noticed, on Classic FM over the weekend, but we don't have the music, we only have the words. In fact, we don't have the music of any song in the Bible. And but the Song of Moses is again a negative one. It's assuming that people will fail. The blessing on the tribes, a bit like Jacob blessing his sons in Genesis 49, and then Moses dies. There are a couple of very conservative commentators over the years who said Moses was a prophet, therefore he prophesied his own death and wrote chapter 34 himself before he died. I mean, that could happen. I don't mean to dismiss it, but I don't think it's necessary to think that. I think like the very first paragraph and the last one and a couple of bits in between, it's probably put together by somebody soon after they've entered the promised land. Why have I given you that? No, I have to do that after the break. It's 5 to 8. I'll pick it up at the fourth point afterwards. Let's take a tea break. I don't know, 10 minutes, is that long enough? Can you bring the tea back in? Tea and coffee back in? Yeah? So let's try and aim for a 10-minute break. I'll say a bit more, and there will certainly be time for Q&A at the end. Well done for listening so far. Well done for coming back in, and thank you to those who provided the supper and tea and coffee. I'll try and leave enough time for questions. Am I on? Did I switch myself off? So I did. Now I'm on. The next little point on the handout, at one level, is a bit technical. I don't want to give technical details, but it might be of interest for some. How do you think of Deuteronomy as a whole book? Because there's so many bits and pieces. There's a bit of history, there's a bit of law, there's preaching, there's a death, and there's blessings, and all this stuff. How does it hold together? And I've tried to give you that sense running through the 34 chapters in point 3 on the handout. In the ancient world, there are documents that have been found where, let's say, a big king, or king of a big country, maybe is a better way of putting it, threatens the king of a little country and says, I'm going to obliterate you and take you over and control you. Imagine, sort of somebody doing that to Canada or Greenland, for example. But if you agree to our terms, and if you pay taxes and do this and that and the other and all these other things I'm going to ask you to do, then we'll look after you and protect you and we'll be allies. Now, those covenantal treaties, there have been some that are found that were in the time of the Hittites in Turkey near the Syrian border, reigned around about 1250 BC. But there are also some from the Assyrians. Their capital was Nineveh and Nimrud, and they date from the 700 and let's say 750 BC. And so what people have thought about and written about for about 100 years now, different scholars, is the similarity of Deuteronomy with that structure. The structure of those covenantal treaties is broadly what are the subpoints of point 4 on the handout. That is an introduction, who is the big nation, who is the little nation, who are the kings, etc. Historical prologue, that is, what's our relationship, what's happened between us in the past. The general stipulations, that is, we want you to show allegiance to us, be loyal. Specifically, we want this tax and this law and that thing to happen. And then we're going to have witnesses, a bit like when you sign an official document today, and they call the gods to be the witnesses. And the sanctions are, well, if you do this, we'll protect you and guard you, but if you don't do this, we'll come and conquer you. That's the sort of treaty. Now, the reason why I thought it was worth including for tonight, for two reasons. One is, it helps us see something of an overarching structure for Deuteronomy. That is, there is a bit of a preamble, the paragraph we read right at the beginning, chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. Chapters 1 to 3 is a bit like a historical introduction, the history leading up to where Moses is preaching. Chapters 5 to 11, general laws about put God first, no idols, etc. Specific laws about a whole range of different things, chapters 12 to 26. The witnesses I haven't commented on, but they're in chapter 4 and 30. It's not God's, of course, because this is a treaty between God and Israel. But I call heaven and earth as witnesses today. You find in both those chapters. Heaven and earth meaning everything, actually. In Hebrew, you often put opposites together to sort of imply everything in between. And the sanctions are the blessings and the curses that I talked about. If you do it, you'll be blessed, and if you don't, you'll be cursed. So there is something structurally, I think, of similarity. Actually, there are three reasons here. A second reason is there's argument, and I say this not to confuse you, but just because some people will start picking up books and reading a bit more about Deuteronomy. When was Deuteronomy actually written? My view is Moses wrote it down, and an editor soon afterwards, a generation later or so in the Promised Land, put in the first paragraph and the end of Moses' life and stuff. But that dating fits roughly the Hittite treaties of around the 1300 BC. I think, if I recall, there's a bit, you can see a Hittite treaty. I think it's in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. But some say Deuteronomy is much later. It was only written in the time of King Josiah, and it's what's famously called by a German scholar 160 years ago a pious fraud. That is, it's got good intent, but it's not from Moses. And what happened was that somebody wrote it, put it in the temple. King Josiah's reforming the nation, cleaning up the temple. Bingo, we've found an old book. Oh, this is from Moses. Oh, this is telling us what we should do. Now, I believe that he found Deuteronomy and that added to his reform, but it's not a new book. But the time of Josiah matches the Assyrian covenant treaties. The third reason for mentioning this, even though there is, I think, a clear similarity of structure, there is a fundamental difference of relationship. The covenantal structures of those kings is threatening. We're offering you peace, but if you refuse, we'll obliterate you. But God is not doing that to Israel. God is saying that what's happened to us before is my work of grace and love and benevolence to you, and that's the fundamental premise, not a threat. But nonetheless, there's a similarity of structure. And I think elsewhere in the Bible, in different sorts of ways, we find similarities with things of that time, but it's the difference that's stark. And I suspect that if they were familiar a bit with those sorts of treaty structures, they would think, hey, but God is so different from the big king. So that's why I put that there. Point 5 is merely to maybe just say a little bit more of what I hinted at early. It's a speech, a sermon really, and like good sermons, it has rhetorical style. I was the second supervisor for an Indian student, a friend of mine. His PhD has just been published under the persuasive language or rhetoric. The something of persuasion in Deuteronomy. That is about the rhetoric of the book. There is a style in Deuteronomy that is persuasive. That's why I think it touched my heart in the train when I was a teenager. And I know, when I was a new vicar at Doncaster, when I was 30 years ago now, we had a sermon series in my first year on the book of Amos. And I remember somebody in the congregation was profoundly deaf, really couldn't hear. And so a lady in the church said, they want to hear your sermons. Why don't I transcribe them? It's before AI, of course, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So she had the tape, and she would spend a couple of hours a week, and she gave me copies. And I thought they were awful. And they were awful because the style of language you use when you speak is different from a written style. We write in a more dense way, or denser way. And when you actually preach, you actually have longer sentences because you hang clauses from things all the time. And that's part of the nature of oral communication and persuasion. And Deuteronomy is a bit like that. It has repetition and motivation all the way through the book. For example, the word land is a very frequent word in Deuteronomy. Of course, it's the thing that's ahead of them. Will you conquer the promised land? But it's never, will you conquer the land that God promised to give you, the land that God swore on oath to give you, the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, the good land, the land flowing with milk and honey, and a whole range of other additives, if you like, to persuade. And many of them are repeated, some, a dozen times, but it's not a boring repetition, the land the Lord you promised to give you, the land that God promised to give you. There's variation, which is persuasive. And it's just drip feeding the idea that this land is not yours to conquer so much as it's God giving it to you. And therefore it's motivational to go into the land. There's rhetoric in the book about what I'm speaking to you today you must do. There's a sense of urgency now. Today you must choose life or death. There's little strings of things. You shall not have a false prophet. No, you shall not have an augur or a soothsayer or a witch or magician, or different categories. And again, I think the sense of this or that or the other has got a bit more of an impact. In the chapter that I'll preach on here, if it's chapter 10, verse 12, you shall... I'm just trying to jump ahead. I can never quite remember. You shall fear the Lord, walk in his ways, love him, serve him, and keep his commandments. 5 things. But actually the impact of that rhetorically is everything for God. That is, we're to walk in his ways, we're to serve him, we're to fear him, we're to love him, they overlap in meaning. You can't say, oh, this means that and that means something different, and 5 different things. And you can't say, well, I'm doing 2 but not 3. They're all overlapping and intertwining, but the rhetorical impact is persuasive. Think, everything for God. My whole life is to be for God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength is not to do A, B, and C, discrete different things. They're all overlapping in meaning, and there's the sense of everything for God. That's the style of Deuteronomy. It's an oral style behind the fact that it's been written down. And therefore it's got persuasion and motivation all the way through the book. So look out for that as you keep reading and as you keep hearing the sermons and so on. The theology. Well, here I want to say what we have in Deuteronomy is a theology of the grace of God at work. I emphasise that because many think the Old Testament is about law and the New Testament is about grace. So the climax of the sermon, which I think is the climax of the theology of the book, is chapter 30. And in chapter 30, Moses says, you will end up in exile. But if, let me read the first 6 verses of chapter 30 and not just sort of briefly summarise it as I try to save some time. When all these blessings I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you, even if you've been banished to the most distant land under the heavens. From there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He'll bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He'll make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. What that's saying is, in the end, grace triumphs. My PhD was published under the thesis, under the title of The Triumph of Grace in Deuteronomy. I don't recommend you pick it up and read it. Unless you're fluent in Hebrew and there's German quotes and all this sort of stuff. But in essence, that was what I was trying to argue in my PhD. That Deuteronomy has a negative sense of the people of God, and therefore as it looks to the future, it anticipates failure. But beyond that and alongside it, God will restore their fortunes because God is a God of promise, keeping his promise and thus exercising grace. The optimism and pessimism is often used by scholars to divide Deuteronomy and the books that follow, as though you can't have both in the same time. And so at a point of the low point of history, this bit must have been written. When the fortunes of the country turn, this bit must be written. It's very naive, in my opinion, and theologically weak. That is, God is the one who gives us optimism and hope. In Deuteronomy, the word heart is frequent compared to the other Old Testament books. And what it's telling us is a number of things. What God wants from us, the Great Commandment says this, is our heart to be right to him. That is, it's not just an external obedience. God doesn't want us just to do this and not do that. He wants our hearts to respond to him with all that we are and have. But our hearts keep failing. So in Deuteronomy, there are numerous times, in English, the word heart gets lost in some translations. But take it to heart this day. In the spies incident, our brothers made our hearts melt with fear. So in chapter 7, verse 17, do not say in your heart that you are afraid. Do not say, chapter 8, verse 17, do not say in your heart that your strength has gotten you all this. Chapter 9, verse, 5, I think. Do not say in your heart a statement of self-righteousness. We are righteous over the nations. A warning of the heart being wrong. And in chapter 10, the passage I'll preach on here in a few weeks' time, you must circumcise your hearts because the heart needs to be right. But how do we do that? Well, you'll have to find out when I preach. But at the end of the day, God promises to do it himself. And where do we see that fulfilled? Not actually at the end of the exile. So when they come back from exile, when the Persians conquer the Babylonians and Cyrus, the Persian king, allows them to go back, when we read Malachi or Haggai, Zechariah, and Ezra, Nehemiah, the hearts are not changed. They're just the same as the people before the exile. And it's only when you get to Jesus, our hearts are circumcised by identifying in Jesus' death and resurrection and by receiving his Spirit. Romans 2 and Colossians 2 both speak about this. Our hearts are being changed. They're not yet perfect, but it's through the power of Jesus' death on the cross that what Moses is predicting comes true. I doubt that Moses is anticipating the cross of Jesus and the Spirit coming. I don't think he's got that picture. But he knows that God is going to change the heart because that's what needs to happen. And the Old Testament story is showing us that even though God makes promises, and even though God acts with forgiveness and mercy and grace, and even though God acts with holiness and judgment at times, and even though he sends prophets and kings and the law and the temple, it doesn't get inside. And it's only Jesus' death that does that at the end of the day. So the picture of God is multifaceted. He's a God of anger, but a God of mercy. Chapter 4, actually, in Deuteronomy has what many would say contradictory statements about God, only, if I recall, 7 verses apart. Chapter 4:24, the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. And in 4:31, he is a merciful God. Both are true all the time. And it's a bit like the optimism, pessimism, the judgment and grace. They belong together, intertwined in ways beyond our full comprehension, reconciled ultimately on the cross. Now, I'm saying all this because I want you to see that in the Old Testament in general, and Deuteronomy is part of that, we have a theology of a God who is gracious and yet holy, the same God as in the New Testament. And the Old Testament is not a plan A that fails, and now he dreams up Jesus to come in the New Testament, which is often how we think. We often think the Old Testament is about law and judgment and God coming down like a stern grandfather or headmaster or something like that. And then finally we get a loving God in the New Testament. But it's not like that. It's the same God. What is it that God requires of people? I already quoted chapter 10, verse 12, to fear him, walk in his ways, love him, serve him, and keep his commandments. But we could also put it like this. What God wants of his people is faithful obedience. Now, I say faithful obedience. Faith and obedience are the flip side of the same coin, we could say. In chapter 1, when Moses recounts the spies incident, he says in verse 26, you rebelled against God. That is, you disobeyed. But speaking of the same sin, just a few verses later, I think it's verse 32, you did not trust God. That's what sin is. Not trusting God, seen in disobedience. The man and the woman in the garden, I preached on Genesis 3 in a church on Sunday. The man and woman in the garden, what was their sin? Well, they ate the fruit. But actually the essence of their sin is they trusted the serpent, not God, and therefore disobeyed. But the New Testament's the same theology. Paul, when he introduces the great gospel letter of Romans, says that the gospel is on about the obedience of faith. It's the same thing. So what God wants in the Old Testament is what he wants in the New Testament, that through faith and trust in God, we will obey. And I said that I would say a bit more about chapters 1 to 3, but I'm almost out of time for doing that. But chapters 1 to 3 is not just a recounting of the spies incident. That is, let me tell you what happened. History in the Old Testament never does that. It's always told so that we respond to God the right way. Who is Moses preaching to in Deuteronomy? Israel, all Israel. But unlike an Anglican church, everybody he preaches to is under the age of 58, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. That is, the adults at the time of the spies have died in the wilderness. That's 20 years old and over. And that was 38 years before Moses preached. So those who were just under 20 are now 58, 38 years later. And some have been born since then. He's addressing the children. And how does he get them to do what their parents failed to do? What he could do, which is a human way of doing it, is saying, you guys are better than your parents. I mean, we all think that, don't we? You guys are better than your parents. You can take the land where they failed. But he doesn't do that ever. Because he actually uses pronouns that says you failed, you rebelled, and you could say, hey, Moses, it wasn't me, it was mum and dad. But he's saying you're the same as your parents. The issue is not that you can do it. The issue is, will you trust? So how does he preach? He doesn't say, come on, do it. You've got to do it. You've got to do it. That's how we often preach. But actually what he does is preach God. Your parents were afraid of the giants in the land and the fortified cities. But God is bigger than that. And he shows it in chapter 2 and 3 by showing how they conquer, or don't conquer actually, they bypass the lands of Edom, here, Moab, and Ammon. All of this is in Numbers. And what were in these countries before, especially when he speaks about Moab and Ammon, they were giants. But God gave them their land, and he's going to do the same to you, so you can trust that God is more powerful than giants. And in the second half of Deuteronomy 2 and beginning of 3, also in Numbers, they actually defeat the kingdom of Heshbon and Sihon up here. They're defeated, they have fortified cities. You're afraid of fortified cities, or your parents were? God's bigger than that. So what he's showing is that God has acted in history in a way that you should have high faith in God, and by having high faith in God's power and faithfulness, you will actually cross the Jordan and conquer it. So he preaches faithful obedience by preaching God, which is what we should all be doing more of, I suspect. Some key themes, I've touched on some of these. Land is a big theme. We've got to be careful with land because, of course, the war in the Middle East has heightened differences of opinion about Israel-Palestine and how Christians respond to this. I think the promises of God to Abraham of descendants, land, blessing, and the world being blessed, nations being blessed, find their fulfillment through Jesus. And the land theme ends up in the New Testament as the kingdom of heaven. The descendants of Abraham racially in the Old Testament ends up basically children of God who believe in Jesus. And the blessings of the New Testament are blessings that pertain to the kingdom of heaven, not to an earthly land. So we've just got to be a bit careful with land theme thinking today. The law theme, I won't say as much as I thought I might get to, but what is its relevance today? It's easy to say, well, we're Christians, we don't really bother with the Old Testament law. After all, we eat pork and shrimps, for example, and so on. But I think if I can give a very quick snippet here, the Old Testament law gives us principles and it gives us examples. For example, if you see your brothers on your way home tonight, if you see your brother's ox or donkey fallen by the road, which you might do out here in Croydon, then you stop and help it up. But of course, it only says ox or donkey. So if on the way home you see your brother or sister's sheep fallen or car broken down, you can ignore that because it's not there, it's an ox or donkey. The principle behind the law, though, of course, is not that ox or donkey matter more than a car or a sheep. The principle behind it is look after your brother or sister's or neighbour's property or something. So we can apply it to a car or a sheep or a laptop or something like this. The principle is, caring for your neighbour, which is a sub-principle of love your neighbour as yourself, if you understand. That's how the law operates. And so there are laws that have stopped through the New Testament. We don't have to go to Jerusalem. We don't have to make animal sacrifices and things like this. But many of the laws still apply. And this, I think, is a helpful way of seeing that. That is, most of us, maybe many of us don't have a parapet on the roof of our house. Now, some of you might. When I used to live in Malaysia and teach there, no one had a parapet on the roof of their house because there's so much rain that all the roofs are like my roof here. It's like this. You don't need a parapet. But the principle behind the parapet on the roof, it's not just there for decoration, it's there for safety. But if you never go on the roof, like if the roof's like this, you don't need a parapet. But the principle of safety, are your electricity points safe? Is your house safe for children? Are the stairs safe? Or the carpet, is that safe to walk on for older people? All those sorts of things still apply. The principles apply and they reapply. So Old Testament law, I think, still matters for us. Deuteronomy is strong on themes of worship, anti-idolatry, putting God first, loving him with all your heart, all your soul, not just part of it, not shared with other gods. That's part of the Great Commandment. Only worship at the place God chooses. So whilst we aren't drawn probably to Canaanite worship, I assume you're not, we are probably drawn to worship the gods of our own age. And whether that's money and possessions, but certainly I think in Australia, comfort, family, security, earthly security, and so on. So I think we've got to identify the gods and idols of our age and make sure we're not worshipping them, putting God first and trusting him utterly. And the blessings and curses, a bit like the land theme earlier in this last section, we've got to be careful with them. We belong not in this particular earthly land in between the Medjed, Red and Galilee seas. We belong in the heavenly kingdom. And the blessings of the Beatitudes of Matthew 5, the blessings of Ephesians 1 and other parts of the New Testament are blessings that pertain to belonging to the kingdom. And so we need to be cautious about lifting out Old Testament blessings and curses and saying, oh, well, we should have children and crops and animals and therefore earthly prosperity if we obey God. The prosperity gospel uses sometimes the blessings of the Old Covenant in Deuteronomy, Leviticus and so on as part of its sort of basis, wrongly in my opinion, because it doesn't see how the Bible fits together and flows. Now what I've tried to do tonight is give you the sort of overview, give you a taste. I've tried to make you salivate a bit for Deuteronomy. I'm hoping that you begin to fall in love with it. I'm wanting you to be prepared for the sermon series that comes. I think we've gone past 9 o'clock. We have, 5 past. My goodness, it's astonishing. You're still here, and most of you are awake. Well done, Merv. I know you have been unwell, but you're still awake. Thank you very much, everyone. Let me hand back to either Andrew or Isaac, I'm not sure.